Walt pushed his mop slowly along the stone corridor, the wheels of his bucket squeaking with every step. The sound echoed off the walls of the sanctuary, bouncing between the tall arched ceilings and dying somewhere far down the hall. He had made this same walk every morning for 11 years. He knew every crack in the floor, every torch bracket, every draft that came through the eastern vents when the mountain wind picked up. He stopped at the archway to the hatchling den and looked in. Sorrel was in the same spot he had been yesterday. And the day before that. The small hatchling lay curled on a wide flat stone near the far wall, his chin pressed against the surface, his pale green scales dull in the low light. His silver wing edges, which used to catch the torch glow and throw little reflections across the ceiling, were folded so tightly against his sides that they were almost invisible. He looked smaller than he was. He looked like something trying to disappear. Walt leaned against the doorframe and watched him for a moment. He had seen Sorrel and Ash together from the very beginning. Two tiny hatchlings, pale green both of them, always touching, always making that soft chirping sound back and forth like they were telling each other things no one else could understand. When the sanctuary caretakers brought food, Ash would always nudge Sorrel toward the bowl first. When the mountain nights turned cold, they would press together on the sleeping stone until they looked like one creature instead of two. Walt had smiled at them many mornings. He was just the janitor. He was not supposed to get attached. But it was hard not to with those two. Then Ash got sick. It started small. A little slowness. A little less chirping. The healers came and looked and spoke in low voices to the elder Marn, and Walt had watched their faces and known it was not good. He had seen that kind of face before on the healers who came for his wife 3 years ago. That careful, sorry face that people make when they already know how something ends. Ash was gone inside 2 weeks. Sorrel had looked for him. That was the part Walt could not stop thinking about. The morning after Ash died, Sorrel had walked in slow circles around the den, sniffing at the corners, checking behind the feeding bowls, stopping at the sleeping stone and pressing his nose to the spot where Ash used to sleep. He had chirped once, a short rising sound, the kind that meant he was expecting an answer. No answer came. He chirped again. Then again. Then he stopped, lay down on the stone and had not really moved since. That had been 18 days ago. Elder Marn stood at the far end of the den now, watching Sorrel the way she watched him every morning. She was enormous, dark gray, with scales that had gone pale at the edges from age. She had lived 400 years and had seen hatchlings grieve before. She had seen them lose clutch mates, lose warmth, lose their first caretakers. She knew how to help with most kinds of hurt. She did not know how to help with this one. She had tried warmth. She had lowered herself beside Sorrel's sleeping stone and let her body heat soak into the rock beneath him. Sorrel had not moved. She had tried sound, the low humming vibration that elder dragons used to calm young ones, a sound that traveled through stone and settled into bones like a heartbeat. Sorrel had closed his eyes but had not relaxed. The caretakers had tried his favorite food, the soft-cooked river fish he used to chirp loudly for every evening. It sat untouched in the bowl 3 steps from his nose. He was eating. But barely. Just enough. Marn looked across the den and met Walt's eyes through the archway. She did not say anything. Neither did he. There was not much to say. They both understood that some grief could not be fixed from the outside. It had to be waited out or it had to find its own way through. Walt picked up his mop and kept moving. He had his own work to do. The eastern corridor needed scrubbing, and the feeding hall stones were sticky from last night's meal service. He had a list, and the list did not care that a small hatchling was lying alone on a cold stone with his wings folded tight and his chin flat and his eyes open and empty. But Walt cared. He scrubbed the feeding hall slowly that morning, his mind somewhere else. He thought about Ash, how that little dragon used to lift his head whenever Walt came through, tracking him with bright curious eyes like Walt was the most interesting thing in the room. He thought about Sorrel doing the same, the two of them swiveling their heads in the same direction at the same time like one animal with 2 necks. He thought about his son Kit, who was coming to visit the sanctuary tomorrow. Kit was 10 years old and had visited a handful of times before. He liked the sanctuary. He liked the smells and the sounds and the way the big dragons moved through the halls like slow weather. Walt had always kept him away from the hatchling den, not wanting to disturb the young ones. He stood in the feeding hall with his mop in his hand and the soapy water going cold around his feet, and he stared at the wall. He was not sure why he was thinking about Kit right now. He went back to scrubbing. Down the corridor, in the quiet of the hatchling den, Sorrel lay still on the sleeping stone and stared at the place where Ash used to be. Kit had never been good at sitting still. At home he was always moving, always picking things up and putting them down, always finding reasons to walk from one room to another even when there was nothing in the other room that he needed. His father Walt called it busy feet. His teacher called it a problem. Kit just called it normal because sitting still had always felt like holding his breath. But when he saw Sorrel, he stopped. He had wandered away from his father that afternoon, not out of trouble but out of curiosity, the way 10-year-old boys do when a long corridor stretches ahead of them and no one is watching. Walt was somewhere in the feeding hall, scrubbing stones. Kit had followed the smell of warm ember and something that reminded him of rain on hot rock, and that smell had led him here, to the archway of the hatchling den. He stood in the doorway and looked in. The den was quiet. There were 3 sleeping stones but only one had a hatchling on it. The small pale green dragon lay with his chin flat against the rock, wings folded, eyes open, staring at nothing. He looked like something that had been set down and forgotten. Kit had seen that look before, not on a dragon but in the mirror about a year after his mother died, when he used to sit on the edge of his bed in the mornings and not know why he should get up. He knew that look. He did not call for his father. He did not back away. He walked in quietly, picked a spot on the floor a few steps from Sorrel's sleeping stone and sat down. The stone floor was cold through his trousers. He pulled his knees up to his chest and looked at the hatchling. Sorrel had not moved. But one eye had shifted just slightly toward Kit. Kit did not smile or wave or make any sound. He just sat there. He had no plan. He was not trying to help, not exactly. He just did not feel like leaving. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually Walt appeared in the archway, mop in hand, and his face did something complicated when he saw Kit sitting on the floor of the hatchling den. He started to say something, then stopped. He looked at Sorrel. He looked at Kit. He leaned against the door frame and said nothing, which was something Walt was very good at when he needed to think. After a while he simply said, "Time to go, Kit." Kit got up slowly. He looked at Sorrel one more time. Sorrel's eye followed him to the door. That night Kit asked his father if he could come back tomorrow. Walt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said yes. The next afternoon Kit returned. He brought nothing with him except himself. He walked into the den, sat in the same spot on the cold floor, pulled his knees up and stayed. Sorrel was in the same position on the stone, chin down, wings tight. But this time both eyes moved toward Kit when he entered. Not afraid. Not curious exactly. Just aware. Kit talked a little that day. Not to Sorrel directly, not really. He just talked the way people sometimes talk when they need the sound of a voice in a quiet room. He said that the mountain smelled different from the valley where he lived. He said his father's mop bucket had a squeaky wheel that drove him a little mad. He said the stone floor was very cold and he should have brought a cushion. Sorrel did not react to any of this. But he did not look away either. Kit came back the 3rd day. And the 4th. Each time he sat in the same spot. Each time he stayed until his father came to collect him. He never tried to move closer. He never reached out a hand or made any sudden movement. He just existed in the same space as Sorrel, quietly, without asking anything in return. On the 5th day something small happened. Kit arrived and sat down, and before he had even settled his back against the wall, Sorrel lifted his chin off the stone. Just an inch. He held it up, looked at Kit for a moment, then set it back down. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Kit pretended not to notice because somehow he understood that making a big thing of it would be wrong. He just adjusted his position on the floor and started talking quietly about nothing, about a bird he had seen on the walk up the mountain path, about how his father had burned the porridge that morning and they had both eaten it anyway without saying anything because neither of them wanted to cook again. Sorrel's tail moved. A small slow shift, just the tip, curling slightly toward Kit's side of the room. Kit kept talking. Elder Marn was in the far archway. She had been watching every visit, silent and still, her great gray head low. She had not interfered. She was not sure what she was watching exactly. She had no name for what this human child was doing because it was not healing in any way she recognized. It was not warmth or song or food or medicine. It was just presence. She had lived 4 centuries and she knew that presence was sometimes the only thing that worked. She had simply never seen a human child understand that without being told. She watched Kit sit on the cold floor with his knees pulled up, talking softly about burned porridge and mountain birds, and she watched the tip of Sorrel's tail curl a little further toward him. She stayed in the archway a long time that evening. She did not leave until after Walt had come to collect Kit, and the den had gone quiet again, and Sorrel had finally, for the first time in 23 days, closed his eyes to sleep before the torches were put out. Kit noticed it the moment he walked through the archway. Sorrel had moved. Not far. Maybe 4 feet. But the sleeping stone where Sorrel always lay was in the center of the den, and Sorrel was no longer in the center of it. He had shifted to the edge closest to the spot on the floor where Kit always sat. His chin was still down, his wings still folded, his eyes still carrying that heavy quiet look. But he had moved. Sometime in the night or early that morning, he had dragged himself those 4 feet closer to Kit's corner. Kit stopped walking. He stood very still and looked at the hatchling. Then he smiled. Just a small one, soft and quick, the kind that comes before a person has time to think about it. He did not say anything about it. He walked to his usual spot, sat down on the cold floor, pulled his knees up and settled his back against the wall the way he always did. Sorrel's eye was already on him. Kit looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked at Sorrel, who was close enough now that Kit could see the small rise and fall of his breathing, slow and shallow, like someone resting but not really resting. Kit had been thinking on the walk up the mountain that morning. He had been thinking about what to say. Not a plan exactly, more like something that had been sitting in his chest for several days, getting heavier, waiting for the right time to come out. He had talked about small things for a week now. Birds and porridge and squeaky wheels. Safe things. Easy things. But Sorrel had moved closer. Kit thought that maybe Sorrel was ready for something that was not easy. He took a slow breath and started talking. He said that his mother's name was June. He said she had red hair and laughed loudly at her own jokes before she even finished telling them. He said she used to make tea in the mornings and bring it to his room even when he was too asleep to drink it, just so it would be there when he woke up. He said that after she died, he used to wake up and look at the empty spot on his bedside table where the tea should have been, and that empty spot was somehow worse than everything else. Sorrel had not moved. But his breathing had changed just slightly. A little slower. A little deeper. Kit kept going. He said that missing someone is a strange thing. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is very quiet, just a shape in the air where something used to be. He said that for a long time after his mother died, he kept thinking he heard her in the next room. A footstep. A sound. And he would look up expecting her to come through the door, and then remember, and the remembering was like something dropping inside his chest every single time, no matter how many times it happened. He said he still had days like that. Not as many. But still. He said he thought that maybe Sorrel knew about that feeling. About looking at a space where someone used to be and not understanding why the space was still there when the person was gone. The den was completely silent. Kit looked at Sorrel and found that Sorrel was looking directly back at him. Not at the wall. Not at the floor. At Kit. Both eyes, open and steady, fixed on his face with an attention that Kit had not seen from him before. It was not the dull empty stare of the first days. It was something else. Something that was paying attention. Kit felt his throat tighten a little. He looked down at his hands. He said that the hardest part was that nobody else remembered the small things. His father remembered the big things, the important things, the things that mattered. But nobody else remembered that his mother laughed before the joke was finished. Nobody else remembered the tea. And those small things felt important too, maybe more important because they were the things that made her her and not just a name that people said carefully around him. He stopped talking. The den was quiet for a long moment. And then Sorrel made a sound. It was very small. Low and soft, somewhere in the back of his throat, the kind of sound that was not quite a chirp and not quite a hum. It was short. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then it stopped. Kit looked up. Sorrel was still looking at him. Kit did not move. He did not speak. He sat very still and let the silence settle back around them, and this time the silence felt different from before. It did not feel empty. It felt like the quiet after two people have said something true to each other and do not need to fill the space. After a while Kit reached into his jacket pocket and took out a smooth flat river stone he had picked up on the path that morning. He had not known why he picked it up. He set it on the floor between himself and Sorrel's sleeping stone, in the small gap between them. He did not push it forward. He just placed it there and left it. Sorrel looked at the stone. Then he looked at Kit. Then very slowly he stretched one foreleg off the edge of the sleeping stone and rested the tip of one claw lightly on top of the river stone. He did not take it. He just touched it. Kit nodded once, quietly, as if something had been agreed between them. In the far archway, Elder Marn stood with her great head low and her old eyes very bright, and she did not make a sound, because she understood that she was watching something that did not need a witness to be real. Marn found Walt in the eastern corridor just after midday. Walt was on his knees scrubbing a stubborn dark stain from between two floor stones, his brush moving in slow steady circles. He heard the sound of her approach before he saw her, the deep soft rhythm of a large dragon moving carefully through a human-sized space, pulling her wings close so they did not brush the walls. He sat back on his heels and looked up at her. Marn was quiet for a moment. She looked at him the way old creatures sometimes look at people, like she was choosing her words from a very large pile and wanted to pick the right ones. She said that Kit needed to stop coming. Walt set his brush down on the edge of the bucket. He did not say anything yet. He waited. Marn explained it carefully, the way she explained most things, with patience and without cruelty. She said that hatchlings and grief were fragile in ways that were hard to see from the outside. She said that bonds formed in that fragile state could grow crooked, too dependent, shaped around the wrong thing. She said that if Sorrel built his recovery around a human child who would eventually leave, who could not stay forever, who would grow up and move away and have a life outside these walls, then what happened when that child was gone? She said the grief would come back and it would be worse the second time. She said she was not angry. She said she understood that Kit had not meant any harm. She said children rarely did. Walt listened to all of it. He looked at his brush in the bucket. He looked at his rough hands. He looked up at Marn, who was watching him with those old pale eyes that had seen 4 centuries of things going wrong and wrong again. He asked one question. He asked if Sorrel was eating. Marn stopped. It was a small stop, barely visible, just a slight stillness that passed through her like a held breath. She had not expected that question. Or perhaps she had expected many questions, arguments, apologies, explanations, and that single quiet question had come from a direction she was not prepared for. Walt asked it again gently. He said, "Is he eating properly now? Real amounts? Not just enough to survive?" Marn was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. Walt nodded slowly. He picked up his brush and looked at it. He asked if Sorrel was sleeping through the night. Marn said yes. He asked if Sorrel had moved from the sleeping stone at all in the last few days, walked around the den, shown any interest in anything. Marn was very still. Then she said that Sorrel had walked to the feeding bowl on his own that morning without being guided. First time since Ash died. Walt nodded again. He did not say anything more. He put the brush back in the bucket and got to his feet, his knees clicking as he straightened. He picked up the bucket handle and looked at Marn politely, the way a man looks when a conversation is over and he has work to finish. Marn watched him. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She left without saying anything else. Walt stood in the empty corridor for a long moment after she was gone. He stared at the stain between the floor stones, which he had not finished scrubbing. Then he picked up his bucket and walked in the direction of the hatchling den. He found Kit sitting in his usual spot, back against the wall, knees up, talking softly. Sorrel was on the sleeping stone, closer to Kit's corner than ever before, close enough that if Kit reached out his arm he could almost touch the hatchling's nose. Walt stood in the archway and watched them for a moment. Then he said, "Kit, I need to talk to you tonight. At home. After supper." Kit looked up. He read his father's face the way children read the faces of people they love, quickly and accurately. He nodded and said okay and did not ask any questions. Walt left them alone for the rest of the afternoon. That evening at home Walt explained it as honestly as he could, because Kit was 10 and 10 was old enough for honesty. He said that Elder Marn had concerns. He said that the sanctuary had rules about bonds between hatchlings and humans, and those rules existed for reasons that were not wrong exactly, even if they felt wrong right now. He said that tomorrow might need to be Kit's last visit for a while. Kit sat at the table and looked at his supper and did not eat. After a long silence he asked if he could go back one more time tonight. Just tonight. Walt looked at him. Then he got his coat. They walked up the mountain path in the early dark, Walt carrying a lamp, Kit walking fast ahead of him. When they reached the sanctuary Kit went straight to the hatchling den. Walt stayed in the corridor. The den was dim, lit by 2 low torches. Sorrel was on the sleeping stone, awake, eyes open as if he had been waiting. Kit sat down in his spot on the floor. He was quiet for a little while. Then he talked. He said he did not fully understand all the rules. He said he was not sure if what he was doing was right or wrong by the sanctuary's measure. He said he was just a janitor's son and he did not know much about how dragons were supposed to grow up or what bonds were supposed to look like. He said that he had lost someone too. And he knew what it felt like to have that empty space beside you. And he had decided, not today but a while ago, maybe the very first day he sat on this cold floor, that Sorrel was his brother. He said that nobody had to agree with that. It was just true. Sorrel was very still on the stone. Then slowly, carefully, he stretched his neck forward until his nose was resting against Kit's shoulder. He stayed there, breathing quietly, warm against the side of Kit's neck. Kit reached up and very lightly placed his hand on the side of Sorrel's head. They stayed like that until Walt came to the doorway and said, softly, "It is time." Marn called the gathering 3 days after Kit's last visit. It was not a small meeting. All 5 of the sanctuary elders came, which had not happened in 11 years. They filled the great council chamber at the heart of the mountain, their bodies taking up most of the floor, their breath fogging the cold air near the ceiling. Marn sat at the center. The others arranged themselves around her in a loose half-circle, old and gray and very still. They reviewed everything. Marn had kept records. She always kept records. She had written down the dates of each of Kit's visits, the duration, what she observed before and after. She had noted the first day Sorrel's eye tracked Kit to the door. The first day his tail moved. The first day he shifted closer on the sleeping stone. The first time he made a sound. The first morning he walked to his feeding bowl without being guided. She had written all of it in the careful, precise language she used for important things, without feeling, just fact. The elders read it in silence. Then they talked for a long time. There were concerns. Real ones, not small ones. The oldest elder, a vast pale creature named Dun who had lived longer than the sanctuary itself, said that a bond built in grief was a fragile thing. He said that humans were short-lived compared to dragons, that Kit would age and change and eventually die while Sorrel was still young by dragon measure, and what then? He said the sanctuary had rules because rules protected the young ones from exactly this kind of complicated attachment. Another elder said that the rules had been written a long time ago and perhaps had not imagined every situation. Dun said that was why rules existed, to cover situations nobody had imagined. They went back and forth for a long time. Marn let them talk. She sat in the center and listened and said nothing until they had all said everything they needed to say. Then she spoke. She said one thing. She said that in 400 years she had seen 6 hatchlings fall into deep grief after losing a clutch mate. She said that of those 6, 2 had recovered fully, 3 had recovered partially and carried difficulty for the rest of their lives, and 1 had not recovered at all. She said she had tried every method the sanctuary knew on all 6 of them. She said Sorrel was going to be the first one she could call a full recovery. She said a 10-year-old boy sitting on a cold stone floor had done what 4 centuries of sanctuary knowledge had not managed to do, and she thought that deserved more than a rule written before anyone knew it was possible. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. Then Dun said very slowly that perhaps they should create a record. They voted. It was not unanimous at first. It took another hour of talking. But in the end every elder in the room agreed, because the evidence was sitting in Marn's careful handwriting in front of them and none of them could argue with what they could see. They called Walt to the chamber that afternoon. He came with his mop bucket still in his hand because the message had reached him in the middle of the corridor and he had not thought to set it down. He stood at the entrance of the great chamber and looked at 5 enormous elder dragons arranged in a half-circle, and his face went very careful and very still the way it did when he was not sure what was coming. Marn told him what they had decided. They were granting Kit an official companion bond designation. It was the first time in the history of the sanctuary that such a thing had been given to a human child. It would be recorded permanently in the sanctuary's oldest book, the one kept in the stone room behind the council chamber, the one that held the names of every significant event in 300 years of the sanctuary's life. Kit's name would be in that book. His bond with Sorrel would be recognized, protected, and honored for as long as both of them lived. Walt stood in the doorway of the great chamber and held his mop bucket handle with both hands. Then he bent his head and wept. He did not make much sound. He was a quiet man and he wept the way quiet men do, with his shoulders shaking slightly and his eyes down and no noise except his breath. Marn watched him and said nothing because she understood that this was not a moment for words. After a minute Walt straightened up, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and said thank you in a very steady voice. Then he asked if he could go and tell his son. Marn said yes. Kit was in the hatchling den when Walt found him. He was in his usual spot on the floor, knees up, back against the wall. Sorrel was on the sleeping stone. They were both quiet, just existing in the same space the way they always did. Walt crouched down and told Kit everything. Kit listened without moving. When Walt finished, Kit looked at Sorrel for a long moment. Then he got up and without saying anything he walked toward the corridor that led to the open courtyard at the heart of the sanctuary, the wide stone yard open to the sky where the adult dragons sometimes stretched their wings in the morning light. Sorrel watched him go. Then he got up and followed. The courtyard was bright. The mountain sun came straight down into it at this hour, warm and clean, bouncing off the pale stone walls. Kit walked to the center and stopped and turned around. Sorrel walked out behind him and stopped a few feet away. He stood in the sunlight and looked up at the open sky above the courtyard walls. His pale green scales caught the light and the silver edges of his wings went bright, the way they used to before Ash died. Then slowly, without rushing, Sorrel spread his wings. Not to fly. Just to open them. Just to feel the air move under them and the sun fall across the full width of them, wide and silver green and whole. Kit stood beside him and looked up at the wings above them both, casting a soft shadow over the courtyard stones. Walt stood at the corridor entrance with his mop bucket and watched his son stand inside a dragon's shadow like it was the most natural place in the world to be. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to.